Striped bass fishing started in Jones's Beach. I fished a fall season over there. I had a couple fish on. I never actually landed a fish in '59. I broke off. In fact, I went up after a hurricane and I had a fish on and a big branch come along in the surf, caught the line and broke me off, and that was the end. And by that time it was pretty much the end of the season. I made my first plug in 1960. I lived in a Cape Cod, and I used to go into the crawl space, which was like a loony space, go over there with a little penknife and hand carve plugs. My wife thought I was nuts. And then I'd buy lacquer and sand seal, dip them in, and use them in fishing, and taking them down to Atlantic Beach and catching some fish on them. In 1960, I was fishing underneath the Atlantic Beach Bridge, and I met two of Dan's buddies, Joe and Al, and they said to me, "You got to meet Dan because he makes some plugs, and you two guys should get together." This was the first plug. Dan made the lips, and I turned the bodies. Charlie calls me up from Block Island. He says, "Don, they're getting a lot of fish on these needlefish." I said, "What are needlefish?" He says, "They look like a cigarette in a sense." He says, I said, "Where do they swim?" I said, "They swim on the top, they swim deep." He says, "Well, they're making them two ways. They're making them on surface and they're making them swim deep." And he says, "This is what they are." He says, they look like a cigarette." I got out some of the old books and I saw Booms. Boom had these hook hangers and everything else, and that was the plug I looked at. And I says, "I don't want that." And I knew from fishing the Cape what sand eels were like, and I come up with the shape that I come up with in wood. And Campo brought him up there, and his biggest fish up there that I know of was on the wood 3-hook one. He took a 59 3/4 pound bass, and that wasn't weighed in until 18 hours after it was caught. So that fish had to be up 61 to 62 pounds. It was a big fish. But I look at some of the guys that are making plugs today, and they are a piece of art. They have the finishes, the rolled epoxy finishes that come out like glass, and it's 50 times thicker than paint. It gives it depth. It's like doing a custom lacquer where you're putting 12 and 13 coats of lacquer on top of a car. It come out like glass. So some of the paint jobs, and there's a few guys that do absolutely gorgeous work, and I see them at these shows, and I tell them, "You do absolutely gorgeous work." As far as making plugs go, any of the wood plugs, the easiest plug in a sense to make is your metal lips, because you got a blunt front or a little curved front, and you cut a slot and you put a lip in it. It's maybe more difficult in balancing the plug, but it's one of the easiest plugs to make. If you're making a popping plug, now you got to concave it out, and you got to put a big massive piece of weight in it. If you're making needlefish, you're really fooling with very, very thin plugs, and then you got to do drilling out that center, and most of my plugs are always made of maple, so that becomes a job and a half. Some of Campo's guys that he knew, it wasn't Steve Campo himself, there was an Angelo, and I can't remember the other guy. They used to go up to the Cape, and they asked me, "Hey Don, could you make a jointed darter?" And I did. I turned around and come out with a jointed darter, and then they said, "Could you make a jointed bottle plug?" And I did that. Well, that there went over, but I didn't make a lot. It was just way too much work. And I think I was only charging like $6